Suffering has always been one of the most persistent questions human beings wrestle with. Why do we suffer? What does it mean? And perhaps more pointedly, if there's supposed to be a loving, all-powerful God, why is suffering so deeply woven into the human experience? People turn to religion for comfort in times of pain. That's understandable. The Bible, in particular, is often treated as a kind of spiritual first aid kit. It's quoted at funerals, leaned on in hospitals, opened up during disasters. But when we take a closer look at what the Bible actually says about suffering, not what we hope it says, not what's cherry-picked in sermons, the picture becomes much more complicated. The idea that suffering is redemptive is central to how the Bible frames human pain. From the book of Job to the New Testament crucifixion of Jesus, suffering is portrayed as something purposeful, even noble. It's framed as a test, a lesson, a punishment, or a path to salvation. But the psychological effect of viewing pain this way isn't always healing. Sometimes it's harmful. Take the story of Job, often considered the Bible's most direct engagement with human suffering. Job is described as a righteous man, upright, blameless, loyal to God. But he becomes the subject of a bet between God and Satan. God allows Satan to destroy Job's life, his family, his health, his wealth, just to test whether he'll remain faithful. In the end, Job doesn't curse God and he's rewarded. But the message here isn't that suffering makes sense, it's that suffering should be endured without question, because it's part of a divine plan you don't get to understand. That's not comfort, that's obedience under duress. And notice, the suffering isn't even tied to Job's actions. He didn't do anything wrong. The suffering wasn't fair, it wasn't justice, it was a wager. That's a disturbing idea when you really sit with it. What does it mean for people going through real pain, illness, poverty, grief, to be told that maybe their suffering is just a cosmic test they'll never understand? In many biblical stories, suffering is also tied directly to sin. It's framed as punishment. The flood in Genesis drowns almost the entire human population because they were wicked. Cities like Sodom and Gomorrah are annihilated. Whole groups of people, including children, are wiped out in the name of divine justice. And when people suffer today, some still carry that ancient mindset. They wonder what they did wrong. Or worse, they're told by others that their suffering must be their fault. That thinking doesn't just echo through scripture, it leaks into culture, into therapy rooms, into how people judge each other, and it leaves scars. In the New Testament, the tone shifts, but not in the way people often assume. Jesus suffers. He's tortured and executed. And this is held up as a model, a sacrificial lamb. The message, again, is that suffering has meaning, that it redeems. But even here, it raises questions. If God needed blood, literal suffering, in order to forgive humanity, what does that say about the nature of this God? Why is pain the currency of salvation? Philosophically, that model of suffering doesn't align with any moral framework based on compassion or reason. It suggests that pain is not only necessary but desirable under the right conditions. That's not healing, that's moral conditioning. There's also an underlying assumption in the Bible that suffering can't just happen because of chance or nature or human systems. It has to be framed as divine intention. Whether it's a punishment, a test, or a lesson, suffering is always filtered through a supernatural lens, but this framework limits how people respond to pain. Instead of solving problems, poverty, disease, inequality, the focus turns to enduring them passively, spiritually, quietly. And this mindset doesn't just fail to ease suffering, it sustains it. You see this even today in communities where people are taught to pray through their suffering instead of seeking help. People who need therapy are told to have more faith. People with abusive spouses are told to be patient and forgiving. People in poverty are told to trust that God will provide. And while faith may bring temporary comfort, it can also delay action, discourage critical thinking, and normalize cycles of pain. The Bible often encourages silence and submission in the face of suffering. In Romans, Paul writes, "We glory in our sufferings because we know that suffering produces perseverance." In James, it says, "Blessed is the one who perseveres under trial." That sounds inspiring until you realize it's being used to train people to accept pain rather than challenge the systems that cause it. There's also a troubling aspect of hierarchy in how suffering is addressed. Biblical texts often emphasize obedience to authority, even unjust ones. Slaves are told to obey their masters. Wives are told to submit to husbands. People are told to respect kings and rulers. So, if those in power cause suffering, well, that's just part of the plan. This kind of thinking blurs the line between spirituality and social control. What's even more overlooked is the way suffering is distributed in the Bible. It's rarely equitable. Whole groups are condemned. Some people are cursed for the actions of others. Children are killed for the sins of their parents. When God punishes Egypt, it's not just Pharaoh who suffers, it's the entire population, including newborns. Again and again, suffering is inflicted on the innocent to make a point to the guilty. That's not justice, that's collateral damage. And then there's the idea of eternal suffering. Hell. The ultimate threat, the punishment that never ends. For finite mistakes, we're told, people can face infinite pain. The logic breaks down completely here. Even the worst crime in human terms has a sentence with an end. But according to many biblical interpretations, someone who simply didn't believe the right thing, who lived a decent life but doubted or questioned, is destined for eternal torment. What kind of system is that? This is one of the darkest ideas in Scripture, that suffering can be not only deserved, but unending. And for many, this concept was introduced in childhood, internalized, feared, carried into adulthood like a shadow. Not as metaphor, but as literal threat. And that fear has real psychological weight. It discourages curiosity. It punishes doubt. It teaches people that the worst thing they can do isn't cruelty or injustice, but disobedience. Not asking the wrong question, but asking at all. And still, people try to reconcile it. They say it's symbolic, or that we shouldn't take it literally. But these ideas have shaped billions of lives, entire cultures, legal systems, ethics, and the ripple effects aren't symbolic, they're real. So what happens when we step outside that framework? When we stop treating suffering as something ordained and start treating it as something to be understood and maybe even prevented? That shift from submission to investigation is what allows real progress, real healing, real compassion. There's nothing noble about unnecessary pain. There's no virtue in passively accepting injustice. And there's no wisdom in glorifying suffering just because an ancient book said it has meaning. We don't need to assign divine intention to every tragedy in order to find meaning in life. Sometimes suffering has no lesson. Sometimes it's just the result of biology or circumstance or human failure. And that's exactly why we should care, why we should act. Not because we think it's part of a plan, but because we know it's not. Pain is real, but so is the power to reduce it. Not through scripture, but through empathy, through science, through reason, through the kind of compassion that doesn't need eternal reward to exist. It just does. And that might be the most meaningful thing of all.